Is a potentially repeatable recursion source like Evolution Witness a card draw spell? How about something that draws and discards like Matsalantli the Great Door? Is that considered a draw spell? What about so-called impulse draw options like Lelia the Blade Reforged? I imagine you might have opinions on any one of those questions. Maybe you said yes to all, maybe you said yes to none, and maybe you're a diehard Great Door fan, no more, no less. It would be satisfying and lovely if I could just flat out say exactly what does and does not count as card draw among these, but unfortunately, it's a bit more complicated than that. Fundamentally, the source of ambiguity here is that card draw as a concept often gets treated as one singular thing, but it's actually more like a web of overlapping solutions to achieve a handful of different goals, and different decks will want different sorts of things deemed card draw for completely different reasons. The goals of card draw are a little fuzzy, but broadly there are two main ones that decks will be focused on: spending excess mana and finding particular cards. Let's start with that first one. The word excess actually might be a bit misleading because for the sorts of decks that will most want to think about their card draw this way, getting excess mana is often a large point of the deck. The most obvious deck style that fits within this description would be Battlecruiser Midrange, a type of deck that is typically late game focused and involves lots of ramp. My Rada deck is an example of this, and it's a good style of deck to build for players newer to the Commander format because it follows a simple principle. Spending more mana than opponents will generally make it easier to defeat them, regardless of what else is happening. In this framework, this requires two simple steps: obtain a larger total pool of resources through ramp, then figure out a way to spend those resources in a way that is supporting what your deck is trying to do. This is actually pretty similar to the process of learning a real-time strategy game. Becoming an average skill StarCraft player basically just requires two things: building up resource generation, and then being able to spend all of the resources you end up accumulating. We can see parallels to EDH Battlecruiser decks with this. As long as you're completing basic tasks like hitting land drops, playing some ramp spells, and spending all your mana each turn, you'll probably be having an okay time. And once you're at that point, you can turn your attention to the specifics of what your mana is actually accomplishing. In the context of this type of deck, a deck chiefly concerned with managing mana gained versus mana spent, all sorts of things can loosely fit into the category of draw. Adding X spells to a deck will typically reduce its need for draw, since they're very effective at spending mana, and the same goes for X abilities and other abilities that are useful to sink a lot of mana into over a turn cycle. These aren't exactly draw, and you'd get some weird looks if you tried to call them that, but they absolutely perform some of the same functions as draw in decks mostly focused on spending mana. The key here is going to be making sure that mana is being spent in ways that are actually effective at pushing toward a deck's goals. Throwing a random fireball in an Ashin deck might make it better at spending mana, but an X-cost damage spell probably isn't a type of card that will generally progress the goals of a creature-based midrange deck. The best available ways to spend mana in an Ashin deck will typically be creatures with on-attack draw abilities that synergize with the deck's commander, and there are also a number of utility lands on Mardu colors that can soak up mana while accomplishing useful tasks for a combat-centered deck. You might have scoffed at the idea that a mana sink spell or ability could be considered alongside draw, and for a lot of decks, that's an entirely valid impulse. Some decks want an ongoing flow of actual factual cards they can play, whether that be answers or utility creatures or anything else, and that brings me to a couple draw alternatives that still lean in the direction of spending mana. The first is cards that exile cards and allow you to play them for the next turn or two, with these effects sometimes being called impulse draw. These don't allow having cards stick around until a potential future point where they're useful, so they're best utilized in decks with few situational cards, and more general purpose cards that the deck will rarely feel bad about casting. Another popular non-draw source of value generation is recursion spells, cards that return things from graveyard to hand. This could be a big one-time option, such as Seasons Past, and it could also be a recursion engine, such as Evolution Witness plus counter shenanigans, Scrap Trawler plus some artifacts, or even something discrete like Phyrexian Reclamation. You could even include graveyard abilities such as Flashback or Escape in this category. All of these options serve a similar task, allowing already played cards to be reused again in some way. These sorts of effects are typically going to be strongest in decks that involve lots of redundancy and similar cards, since returning a common card type from graveyard to hand is going to be pretty similar in effect to drawing one of those cards. However, these still tend to have limitations in that they require having stuff in the graveyard to function. For a deck with lots of sacrifice, or which is based around instants and sorceries, key cards will get into the graveyard all on their own, but other types of decks might want sources of self-mill or self-discard to keep their graveyard stocked with juicy options for returning. Generally, the more self-mill or wheel style effects you add to a deck, the more your recursion spells will stray away from the task of spending mana and start to gain some genuine selection potential, and this brings me to the second goal. The second goal of so-called draw is finding particular cards you need, and this goal tends to be served by cards that might be considered filtering. Cards that draw and discard, or otherwise filter through cards without obtaining card advantage, are going to be better and better the more a deck cares about specific cards. The most obvious case is in finding something like a combo piece, but the same could go for a deck that has 5 prominent centerpiece synergy cards that would like to find one or more of. On a more abstract level, filtering will have the greatest utility in decks with a high degree of variation between cards, or variance between different power levels. Seeing 3 different variants of a low-cost beater with a filtering spell like Dig Through Time isn't going to be getting a whole lot of usage out of the card, while seeing a bunch of wildly different cards is much more potent. Likewise, if you're casting Impulse, seeing 4 different cards of roughly the same power level is, on some level, getting less use out of the card than if you saw 3 filler cards and a powerful centerpiece. If we want to stretch the definition of filtering a little, and I certainly do, Tutors are the ultimate example of this. Cards that search a player's library for a card that fits some set of constraints. Solve the Equation is basically a Solundi Vision that looks at unlimited cards instead of 6, and Demonic Tutor is basically an Impulse that looks at unlimited cards instead of 4. Sorcery speed though, so it's pretty balanced. So, do tutors count as card draw? Do cards like Impulse count as draw? It depends on what your deck's goals are with running these cards. In some decks, it might be important to distinguish between what cards give card advantage as opposed to what cards only give card selection. A Spellslinger deck might run Impulse, and it might be a helpful card for smoothing out gameplay, but if the deck is currently running a fairly low number of draw engines, it's not necessarily going to be a helpful addition for purposes of maintaining cards in hand. Likewise, if you have a really impactful card you're tutoring for, a tutor very well could feel like a draw spell, particularly if it's a tutor that generally searches up some sort of value engine. A Steel Shaper's Gift that exclusively finds a Skull Clamp followed by Sword of Fortune Frontier? That's a draw spell. Get it out of that tutor category. When I'm deck building on Architect, I'll generally put tutors in my draw category in 2 cases: if they generally find a source of card advantage, or if the function of tutors wholly lines up with the function of drawing cards. For example, if I'm playing a combo deck where the main thing my draw spells accomplish is digging for combo pieces or tutors, then the purpose of my draw is almost exclusively card selection, and tutors accomplish that. I've also reached the same conclusion in the opposite direction. My Brina deck is an aggro deck with lots of redundancy, so tutors aren't much better than basic card draw. When I added Ayara's Oathsworn because of its synergy with the commander, there was no reason for me not to group it with the deck's draw, because it's performing the same task. However, in other decks, tutors play a somewhat distinct role. In my strongest deck, I run tutors to find Time Sieve because that's what I need to win, but I also run Bident of Thassa effects, which generically draw cards when my creatures hit players. This can help find Time Sieve, but it can also draw me into counterspells to protect my combo, and if Time Sieve is up and running but I don't have a full combo, having an engine that gives me an extra 3 to 4 cards a turn is typically enough to turn a couple extra turns into a win, by helping me find things to give extra artifacts. Card selection and card advantage are both helpful, and having a mixture of selection-only cards and generic card draw that provides both works out to fulfill the deck's needs in the draw department. We can actually construct a spectrum and place all the types of cards I've mentioned today on it. On one side, we have pure selection, effects that are all about seeing extra cards, and on the other side, pure advantage, cards that turn mana into value without seeing any cards at all. Ledger Shredder, pure filtering. Tutors, generally also pure filtering, though a bit flexible depending on what you plan to get. Cards like Dig Through Time still lean toward filtering, though at least here you're getting some actual factual card advantage by being one card that finds 2 cards. I'd also put Greater Good here, a powerful green draw enchantment that tends to churn through cards at a fast rate. Nearing the center of this spectrum, you've got things that generate a decent bit of card advantage, but that also do a bit of extra digging. And this includes my personal favorite draw X card in most decks, Pull from Tomorrow. It's instant speed, reasonably costed, and the disadvantage of discarding a card is typically negligible since it's attached to a card that draws a bunch of cards first. You could also put something like Necropotence here, since, absent a Reliquary Tower, you'll generally be exiling some amount of what you draw, even if there's a lot of volume of cards entering your hand. Generic card draw leans a bit toward advantage compared to other options, though a lot of the strongest draw is just generic card draw, so oftentimes decks will focus on this, even if they care mostly about card selection. After that, you've got impulse draw and recursion engines, and while the former is relatively straightforward, the latter will vary a bit depending on how well it's supported. Recursion spells might lean very close to advantage, though they also might have some degree of selection as well depending on how much self-mill and discard a deck has. It's often far easier to get cards to the graveyard than into hand, but the tools for hating on graveyards are far stronger and far more ubiquitous than cards that force opponents to discard are, so recursion has some natural limits in how reliable it can be. On the far end of things, we have abilities that can soak up an unlimited amount of mana. Kessig Wolfrun is a land with a powerful activated ability that a deck can sink as much mana as it likes into. It will never find you any cards, but it can grant the value of giving a creature you control +X+O and trample, and the only cost to have this ability available is running a colorless land. So this is a spectrum of what different styles of draw and filtering will accomplish in terms of value and card selection, but I worry that all this categorization and visual flourish and such like might serve to abstract the issue beyond what's helpful. So how do you find the best options for your deck, and how do you know when you have enough? Let's start with that first question. Broadly, what types of value generation and filtering you'll want will depend on your game plan, your colors, and what sorts of stuff your deck is made up of. Generally, the more variation that exists between your different cards, the more you'll want to focus on filtering. If you have lots of situational cards, or a handful of specific cards you want to find, you'll want to lean toward cards that allow you to see more of your deck. Look for options closer to the right end of the spectrum I gave earlier. Tutors, draw and discard, top deck manipulating cards, and so on. Notably, it's generally pretty rare that a deck will want exclusively card selection, so your task will be in figuring out what amount and what forms of actual draw you want to pair with your filtering. In some cases, selection and advantage options will mesh together quite nicely. Recursion and abilities that can be used from the graveyard work great as an advantage source to pair with card selection in the form of draw and discard. The selection feeds the advantage options that might be a bit mediocre on their own. Likewise, running tutors to find a centerpiece draw engine is another popular way to combine a selection option with an advantage option. For a third, somewhat more specific example, sometimes you'll have creatures that do some sort of top deck filtering thing on an attack or combat damage trigger, and pairing these with curiosity style effects can set you up quite nicely for a second main phase. On the opposite end of things, decks that lean toward advantage as the preferred card type typically include more redundancy. Put simply, you don't need to spend nearly as much effort finding a specific sort of effect if you're running 10 or 15 of it. I've also found that needing less card selection tends to correlate with a couple other things as well. For one, decks that rely on and leverage their commander more aggressively tend to run less card selection, since they already have their most important card available. Secondly, decks that ramp more tend to run less card selection and more actual factual draw, since they can generally afford to sink more mana into multiple cards, rather than digging around for the ideal one to cast. Neither of these things are set in stone rules. You'll have decks that want to find specific sporting cards for their powerful commander, and you'll also have decks with very specific ideas of what they want to do once they've ramped up to a lot of mana. These are just trends to keep in mind when you're trying to identify your deck's needs. With that, let's talk about the final question of this video. How much advantage acquisition should your deck run? If you're playing a deck that doesn't care as much about selection, focus on ability to generate mana versus ability to spend mana. If you're missing land drops, add lands. If you're falling behind in gameplay volume, add some ramp. If you're finding yourself with excess mana, add some mana sinks like draw, abilities, or graveyard themes. If you're finding yourself with a lot of cards in hand, try trimming a bit of draw, or orienting your deck toward mana-efficient but card-inefficient cards like single-target removal, low-cost ramp, and situational parity breakers. You might think that your first priority should be the game plan of your deck, and that does matter for sure, but for just about every type of effect you could want to lean toward, there will be versions that are more mana-efficient and versions that are more card-efficient, so you can always be keeping an eye on that balance. Now, let's say you care more about card selection. For starters, you'll want to be able to make sure that whatever you're running card selection for is being attained. Are you able to filter into key cards? Are you able to find your situational answers in reasonable lengths of time? Once this seems to be in a decent spot, start keeping an eye on how often you're able to find your actual factual draw. Typically, actual draw will be, at a minimum, helpful for finding interaction for what opponents are doing, particularly if you're focused on mana-efficient but card-inefficient options. It also might be key for getting more definitively ahead once you have some amount of setup complete but don't quite have control over the game yet. As you've probably noticed, the point of this video hasn't been so much to tell you what is or isn't draw, but rather to give you a framework to work with in analyzing cards and deciding if they're what your deck needs. A lot of times building commander decks is reduced to following a template, and if a template calls for X number of draw spells, you're gonna want to know what counts as draw. And don't get me wrong, that sort of approach is a perfectly fine way to toss together a deck quickly, and hopefully this video was helpful in figuring out what you would consider draw for those purposes. But take a bit of extra time to figure out how all the individual working parts of your deck fit together, and you'll have a much stronger end product. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Architect for supporting the channel. You can find my decks and their lovely draw suites at a link down in the description. I'd also like to thank my patrons for their support, some of whom are on screen now. If you want to support this channel, you can sign up at my Patreon at the link down in the description.